Welcome to the JC Raulston Arboretum. We're standing here in the Lath House. Lath is L-A-T-H. If you've ever had an old house and before there was plasterboard, the crude layer of plaster was put over wooden strips that were nailed to the wall. And this structure is made out of similar narrow strips of wood to provide a semi-shaded situation. The Lath House, in the Lath House, we create sort of Garden of Eden conditions. They're all raised beds, about 2 feet tall, with a very well-drained soil mix. And the Lath House is irrigated twice a day through the warm months of the year. So we can grow a lot of things in here that we might not succeed with out in the real world, but the Lath House largely is not meant to be the permanent home for any of the plants in the Arboretum plant collection, but rather is a place where we initially test them to see if they're suited to our winters and summers. If they succeed and they thrive, well then they will go out to the garden, or at least part of them, and we'll see how they fare out in real soils without the regular irrigation. And some things start in the Lath House only because they arrive as such tiny little plants that get lost out in the wilds of the rest of the Arboretum. So that's all I'm going to say about the Lath House. Well, I will say one other thing. If you are a student of the Lath House, you might notice that some of your favorite plants might no longer be in here, and that's all part of the process of moving things out into the real world. So very few plants are totally eliminated. Usually they're just transplanted elsewhere in the Arboretum. In hot weather, a shade garden can be a nice respite from the heat and the sun. And so I will talk about a number of excellent plants for the shade garden. Might as well get hostas out of the way. Hostas are sort of the queen of the shade garden, provided you can protect them from the creatures that consider them a delicacy. This is one called First Lady. The growing conditions in the Lath House are really good, so most hostas are going to look good all summer long up until killing frost in the fall. I think if you're deciding what hostas to add to your garden, a really good time to go shopping and see what hostas are worth adding is late summer and early fall if they're planted in the ground, not in a nursery situation, because you can see which hostas still look good come late summer. We have one in the garden, Paradigm, which is just gorgeous up until frost, and it's one of those ones with a green margin and a chartreuse green center to the leaf. And an old standby for a blue hosta, Halcyon, is still one of the best of the blues, and it looks great up until well into the fall. So sometimes the tried and true ones are a good bet for the home gardener. Nowadays, hostas, there's teeny tiny hostas. There's some that make clumps 6 foot across. So there's such a range of hostas. And nowadays, people like Tony Avent are breeding for floral display, big branched inflorescences. This is not an example of that, but the hosta flowers are fairly showy on their own. We'll sort of be jumping back from one group of plants to the other, as because that's the way the Lath House is planted. Most of the fuchsias that are common in the nursery trade really want to live in Seattle or Tierra del Fuego in the southernmost part of South America. But this is a hybrid one that was bred for heat tolerance, and though this plant today isn't loaded with flowers, it has been for most of the summer. We'll peek at another specimen that has quite a few flowers on it. And it has a fairly dreadful cultivar name, Cena. I hope you can see that. Nowadays, cultivar names are often not user friendly. It does have the trademark name of Angel Earrings Cascading, but a great plant. It certainly doesn't need the growing conditions of the lath house to survive, but I would avoid a very dry spot in shade. That is the issue with the shade garden. It's not so much the shade that is limiting. Certainly there are plants that don't want to be in a shade garden, but in most situations the shade is due to trees, and often the plants growing under those trees are competing for moisture. So it's often the moisture level, the soil moisture level, that's more limiting than the amount of shade. Though one can get too shady, and then your choices for the shade garden are even more limited. But if it's bright shade, there's a wide range of things, provided the moisture level's not too extreme. Most hydrangeas prefer shade over sun. Hydrangea paniculata, the big white one that is common in gardens, is definitely a sun lover, but the majority of hydrangeas are happier in shade. And this is Hydrangea involucrata. An involucre is a whorl of bracts, and if you look at this big flower bud, it has these bracts, the scales covering the flowers, it's a whorl of them. And it's the cultivar Ruhren, R-U-T-E-N, but it's in the nursery trade as Blue Bunny. It's now mid-August and it's just starting to bloom, which is really nice because the majority of other hydrangea species are more spring and early summer blooming. So this one's just starting. It's quite a handsome foliage plant as well. The leaves are really rough, like other close relatives of this hydrangea. And we'll see a few others today. Now, this bed is, maybe 18 inches. I stood up on top of the wall a moment ago, and so this is actually about 5 feet tall, though it will get a bit taller. It was pruned fairly heavily this winter just to reduce its size some. Now, we don't yet have this in the ground outside the lath house. That'll happen this year. And a year from now, we will have a better idea of if it's suited to our normal growing conditions, which it should be. Now, I do want to point out this is one of our native deciduous azaleas. Very good plant for the shade garden, but the point I want to make about our native deciduous azaleas is that they do super well in full sun. They don't have to have shade. So you can go either way with our native deciduous azaleas. Of course, Japanese maples. This is one of the weeping dissectums. Are happier with some shade. They'll tolerate full sun, but they're a little bit happier if they're not stressed out by full sun all day. And I was doing a little bit of research on Japanese maples last night, and I discovered that in Japan, the leaves of Japanese maples are battered and deep fried. Tempura, like tempura vegetables in a Japanese restaurant. So if you see momoji tempura on a menu, it's fried Japanese maple leaves. Now, the important culinary tip to remember is that the Japanese maples that have yellow fall color are the ones to deep fry, because the ones with red fall color taste bitter. So now you know how to use your Japanese maple in the kitchen. All right, we'll continue along this way. Ferns are certainly one of the stars of the shade garden, though I do want to make the point that not all ferns want shade, the majority do. This is a real interesting fern. This is Pirozia Polydactyla. Polydactyla, poly means many, and dactyla is referring to fingers. So you see where it gets its common name. And at least the Pirosias I know are evergreens, so they're a plant that's attractive year-round. This one seems to be a clump former, but the more common Pirozia Lingua, which we'll see in a few minutes, are slowly spreading. And next to it, we have a beautiful ginger. Now, this is not the culinary ginger or even related to it, but these little acerums are referred to gingers because at least our native species have very fragrant leaves, sort of spicy like ginger. But this one's not particularly fragrant. And this is one that Mark collected in Taiwan in 2009. It's Acarum macranthum. And the foliage I keep on pulling back right here is an impatient, a perennial impatient that mostly goes dormant in the summer, then comes back up in early fall and blooms really nicely then. But the little, the acerums, the majority of them are evergreen. There are some deciduous ones, and some are clump formers, and some are spreaders, and this seems to be a modest spreading one. This is another ginger, another one that Mark collected in Taiwan in 2014. We don't currently have it labeled with a specific epithet, but no, I never tire at looking at this foliage. It's just such beautiful foliage. The acerums mostly are fairly drought tolerant, not super drought tolerant, but it's not a plant that has to have a moist woodland condition, just average moisture. All right. And we're standing here next to a giant Solomon seal. This is actually our native, one of our native species, this Polygonatum biflorum. And let me stand up on the wall. You know, it's close to 4 feet tall. And there are a couple other genera that are closely related to Polygonatum that we'll see today, Disporum and Dysporopsis. They all have typical little creamy, well, not all, but most of them have little creamy white pendant bells. You can see the flowers were replaced by these big blue, sort of blackish blue fruit. I think there's just one seed in any one of these. Well, I'm not making any progress scraping off the fleshy part, but I think they're mostly single-seeded fruit. And they're real slow to germinate, but they can be raised from seed. The Solomon seals grow from a rhizome underground. Most of them are fairly slow spreading, but are really beautiful woodland plants. We see this sign for Acanthus. Acanthus are good woodland plants, but this Acanthus is mostly dormant. You can see a remnant of its foliage. They go dormant in the heat of the summer, especially if they're in a dry situation, but they freshen back up in the fall. But what we're looking at here is one of the Coniogrammes, which is another genus of evergreen ferns. And this is the cultivar Shishi. I think Shishi is referring to lion or lion's mane. And you see the tips of the leaves are all divided into these finer divisions rather than just coming to a single point. And the Coniogrammes, even though they are here in the lath house, we do have them outside of the lath house, and they do perfectly well in average moisture situations and shade. All right. And we'll turn around here and look at another selection of Coniograme, the bamboo fern. And let's see. This one we have a number of stands of in the garden, and it really does well even in those drier shade situations. And I think I found its label. Yeah, it's Coniograme intermedia, Yoroi musha. Can you see the label from there, or do I need to bring it closer? Okay. And, you know, we saw the Hydrangea involucrata over there. These are just two selections of Hydrangea Macrophylla, the real common, typically blue hydrangea. In here, where they get watered twice a day, the spent flowers aren't holding up as well, so I think we might be cutting them down before too long. I'm going to take a step this way, and because I don't want to miss this glorious hydrangea. This great big guy is a selection of Hydrangea Aspara. Aspara meaning rough, and the leaves are fairly rough. And this is one that Mark collected on one of his trips. I just think it's spectacular, and anything that looks great in August really earns a whole bunch of bonus points in my book. And it's typical of a wild hydrangea where you have a limited number of these large sterile florets, and then you have hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny fertile florets in the center. And it looks like on the flowers that are still up, they're pink in bud, and then when they open up, I guess those are the anthers, the stamens that are sort of blue-violet. And then when they're done blooming, the seed pod initially is sort of purple. It is a big thing. I am standing at the same level that it's growing, so I'm almost 6 feet tall, so this is 7 or 8 feet tall. So probably not for your window box, but if you have a large woodland garden, this is one to try. Now, we did stick cutting, so maybe we'll have plants to distribute later on. In the summer, when there's not an overabundance of things in bloom in the shade garden, things with handsome foliage are really valuable, and Fatsia japonica is sort of an old southern standby that's become a better plant as the climate has gotten warmer. But, you know, beautiful evergreen shrub, number of variegated cultivars are available. And I'm standing right by this Tricertus. This is one of the toad lilies. This is Tricertus formosana. Formosana can indicate that it's from Taiwan because Formosa is an older name for that country. But Formosa also means beautiful or showy. And a lot of Tricertus in bloom are a lot showier than this one. But they're good woodland plants for bloom in late summer and early fall. And there's many with showy variegated foliage. We might get around to seeing some of them today if I speed up. All right. I'm gonna head this way. Not far, maybe almost stay there. We met hostas, and probably everyone in the audience are fully familiar with hostas. Two, what I think of as alternatives to hostas are Aspidistra and Rhodia. They're both Asian plants, well, so is hosta. And Aspidistra and Rhodia are both evergreen. So they have, I'll put it in air quotes, that advantage over hostas. They also, hostas are really tough. If you're experiencing a dry summer, generally hostas aren't going to die, but their foliage might get real tired looking. Whereas it takes a whole lot more drought to make an aspidistra or a rhodia look bad. They're much more drought tolerant than hostas. And nowadays there's quite a few different cultivars. This is the genus Aspidistra is fairly large. Not all of them are winter hardy here, though quite a few of them. Some of them are more subtropical to tropical origin, but this is Aspidistra basilis, but selection called green genes. The common Aspidistra that we've grown forever is Aspidistra elatior. And then the rhodia, the rhodia that's been common in gardens is Rhodia japonica. This is a really beautiful cultivar, Fuji no Yuki, referring to Mount Fuji. I think Yuki is snow. And, you know, we'll see other examples of Aspidistra with spots and stripes and such. Taking a few steps this way. It's a real exciting time for shade gardeners because there are a lot of begonias that are proving to be winter hardy. This one's gone through 2 winters now. This exact plant in this location has gone through 2 winters now. And I'm not finding its late. There it is. Well, it says Begonia AFF, which means affinity palmata. So whoever collected thought it looked like palmata, but nobody's, said yes or no. It's definitely palmata, but it's similar to Begonia palmata. Pretty. The underside of the leaf is just as pretty as the top of the leaf. All of the hardy begonias completely disappear in the winter, but come back in the spring and are good looking all summer. All the new hardy begonias, and we've planted quite a few this year that haven't yet gone through a winter, but are supposed to be winter hardy, it's really exciting that we have all the new begonias to try. But another group of plants that are sort of we weren't aware of maybe 20 years ago are members of the African violet family, the Gazinariaceae. It is largely a tropical family, but there are actually quite a few that are winter hardy. And this is one that we've grown for quite a few years. It's Tano Tricum. I think I see its label. So you can see how it's spelled, and old hamiide, oldham. I forget, oldham. Well, Oldham was an Englishman, I guess, somewhere serving in maybe Taiwan or someplace. So you see that name on a bunch of Asian plants. And it completely disappears in the winter and doesn't start blooming until probably August. It reminds me a bit of a foxglove in bloom, but these bright yellow flowers with the cinnamon red center to the flower. It's spreading fairly steadily underground. Right.
One of the common names is false foxglove.
Okay, that's not surprising. Many aroids prefer shade, and this is a really beautiful little Eumorpha. Most Eumorpha that are winter hardy, the leaves get about 3 or 4 feet tall, but Eumorpha henryi, that's probably only about a foot tall. And the flowers are fairly showy and large for a plant of this stature, but beautiful habit to the foliage. Oh, and another begonia to point out. This is a begonia that Mark acquired with the cultivar name of Red China. The newest foliage has sort of a reddish cast to it. very red on the underside. And this has gone through 2 winters, and it was one plant, and now it's spread to almost 3 foot wide. And hostas. Here's an example of Hosta elatior with stripes and spots. If all these markings make you nervous, well, plain green leaves are beautiful too. I think they're fun. Looks like looking up at a night sky. It's the Aspidistra cultivar Taihou, Taihou. Another member of the African violet family, the Gazinariaceae, is this Hemabolia. When we planted it 2 or 3 years ago, we didn't realize it was such a spreader, but it is quite a bigger spreader. So if you have a large area in the shade to cover, it's good for that. You can see a tubular flower similar to the Titano Tricum. And one of the interns last year discovered that if you squeeze this bud, it's always filled with water. And I don't know if you can see it squirting water. It's a pretty odd thing. Let me see, maybe I do it. What's that?
Yeah, right there.
Okay, good. Shall I squeeze it? Can you see it holds quite a bit of moisture in there? I don't understand why, but it does. This, I'm not seeing its label right away, is, I believe this is Hemabolious Subcapitata. We have another species which we haven't had in the ground yet that is quite a bit showier in bloom. The flowers are twice the size and a sort of purple violet color. And I promised to show you a Tricertus with beautiful variegated foliage. This is one called Imperial Banner. It is blooming now. The flowers are showy. It's certainly not covered in flowers, but you see the foliage is really handsome. You do notice a number of green stems. This is one of those variegated plants where you need to go in periodically and pull out any of these solid green stems so they don't overwhelm the variegated one. Beautiful thing. If you visit the Arboretum, you will see a number of begonias with real colorful foliage. There are ones that are potentially winter hardy, but haven't yet gone through a winter. So if you see something in the ground in the Arboretum and you don't know how long it's been planted, it might not yet have gone through a winter. These are some real handsome ones. We met the evergreen fern, the Pirozia Polydactyla, with the fingered-like frond. This is a yellow leaf selection of another species of Pirozia, Pirozia Lingua. Limon is the cultivar name. Lingua, if you go into a real Mexican restaurant and order tacos lengua, that's beef tongue. Well, Pirozia Lingua is the tongue fern because of the tongue-shaped frond. There are many cultivars, and we'll probably see a few today, where the frond is, divided and stuff. But the wild type just has this simple tongue-shaped frond. Another Gazinariad, this Syningia, one called Pink Pockets. Last year it didn't do well. This year it's been spectacular. Last summer was a whole lot wetter, and I think maybe it just stayed too wet, but I'm just thrilled with it this year. It went through one winter thus far, though it comes to us from Plant-A-Light's nursery as with the information that it is winter hardy in this area. A fern that's a little bit similar to the Pirosias is this Neolipasaurus. Now it's the taxonomists seem to be going back and forth between this genus and another one. So I think I hear someone in the audience today screaming, it's not Neolipasaurus anymore, but I don't remember what the other genus is. It's evergreen here. It's spreading fairly steadily. We have it outside the lath house in a spot that's naturally more on the moist side. I suspect it'd be really pretty on if you built a wall that was kept damp, it'd probably hang down really nicely. And maybe I should say something about acubas. Acubas are like aspidistras. If you don't like spots, well, then there's others with beautiful green foliage. This plant is, we recently took a lot of cuttings off of it because often we will propagate something before we transplant the original plant, so we have backups. So this still looks quite showy, but it was a lot showier a few weeks ago. But it's Acuba japonica, Linda Eggins. And I believe Linda Eggins holds the national collection of Acubas in England. So it's named for her. Aspidistras definitely prefer the shade garden. They don't want to be out in hot sun. They're pretty indestructible. Just don't plant them in a spot that stays soggy after a rain. Just average soil and bright shade is good for them. The plants are either male or female. The females have a good size fruit, maybe about the size of my thumbnail, typically red fruited. But there are white and yellow and pink fruited cultivars as well. You do need both male and female. The flowers are, I wouldn't describe them as showy. They're maroon and fairly small, but in a significant size spray in late winter. It's a great plant for, cut flower arrangements. Especially winter arrangements, you can bring it in the house and enjoy it for months. And then by the time you get tired of them and you throw them out, you realize they've rooted in the vase of water. This begonia is one called Little Brother Montgomery. Little Brother Montgomery was a famous jazz musician. And I know Plant Delight's nursery doesn't consider it winter hardy. We have gotten it through 2 winters, but we haven't exactly had cold winters. But I just wanted you to see that because I think it's really pretty. Next to it is Dicroa. Dicroas are close relatives to hydrangeas, being in the same family. They're moderately showy in bloom. The Dicroa species that's common in gardens is Dicroa febrifuga, meaning lowering a fever. If you're probably aware of the medical term febrifuge, a compound that's used to lower fevers. Well, in Asia, where Dicroas are native, it's one of the most important medicinal herbs. But the main reason why we grow Dicroa febrifuga is the fruit are cobalt blue all winter. And we haven't had them fruit much in the garden. I have wondered if it maybe you need more than one individual, not male or female, because they have perfect flowers, meaning both male and female parts, but they might need that cross-pollination. Architectural plants, in the shade garden, you don't have things like agaves and yuccas for bold architecture, but the mahonias, some of them are really beautiful architectural plants. And this is a mahonia that was collected from Mount Emei in China. It's blooming this time of year, which is an odd feature, but I just think the foliage is really beautiful year round. Hostas come in solid green as well. There was a time in my life when I worked in very colorful gardens most days of the week. When I came home, I was happy just to have beautiful green foliage. This is a wild, a species hosta, Hosta ventricosa. It's actually quite beautiful in bloom. The flowers are a darker purple violet than most other hostas. And as you can see, it's very fertile. All these fruit are loaded with seeds and will probably deadhead it before too long so that we don't have 1,000 seedlings to dig out. If you grew up in the Northeast, this is a real common plant around old houses. Another example of a aspidistra with striped leaves. You all probably know the common name of cast iron plant for aspidistras. Well, that comes from the Victorian era when they were a common house plant in Victorian houses, which had, neither heat nor much sunlight, and they still persisted. Very unusual ajuga incisa, which grows with a stem, not a ground-hugging basal rosette, and it's also deciduous. It disappears in the winter. It has typical blue flowers in the spring, but is a really beautiful cultivar in this variegated clone called Bikun, B-I-K-U-N. Does it help if I show the label? Got it? Let's see. We'll look at this. We saw a bunch of Hearty Begonias. This one is not being a good representation of itself. I think, we think of the lath house as being a shade house, but it's really more sun than shade. Right now, the sun is behind a cloud. But for the longest time, the only begonia that we thought was winter hardy or knew to be winter hardy was Begonia Grandis. You might also know it by the older name of Begonia evansiana. This is even hardy in the Northeast, up near New York City. There's a newer selection that is absolutely superb, and we have it in the garden, but we're not going to. We'll take the 5 minutes to go walk and see it. It's Begonia Grandis, pink teardrops, and this one in front of us would probably have clean foliage if it was in heavier shade, but pink teardrops has been blooming at least since June. It almost seems like it might have even started earlier than June. And it's in full bloom today on August 18th. And it's a 2017 introduction from Plant Delight's nursery. And it's just an amazing garden plant to have something that's blooming for months and months in the shade garden. And in the catalog, the Plant Delight's catalog, they said it blooms into September. It's not hard to believe that because it's, still going strong in the middle of August. So Begonia Grandis is certainly worth growing. If you want the long period of bloom, I'd plant pink teardrops. The fruit on Begonia Grandis, the seed heads are quite attractive too. Of course, in the winter, they're just brown, but they have a real pretty structure to them. This is another hydrangea closely related to the two we met today, the Hydrangea involucrata blue bunny and the big Hydrangea aspera. This is Hydrangea longipes, I think referring to the long stems. And it's white and, it was at its peak many months ago, but still somewhat showy with the spent seed heads, flower heads. Daphnes are Daphne odora. I know you all say odora, and we do adore Daphne odora, but I think and I might be the one mispronouncing it, but it's referring to the fragrance of the plant, the odor. Great plant for shade, definitely is not a sun plant, and it's also a great plant for dry shade. This is the cultivar Majima. Obviously, the wild type of Daphneota would have a solid green leaf. There have been variegated ones in the nursery trade for probably just as long as the plant's been grown. As a matter of fact, for a while, you only saw the one with the narrow cream margin to the leaf. It was the solid green ones, which were unusual. But nowadays, there's quite a few cultivars with real showy variegations. I imagine most of you know this plant. It starts blooming January or so, and the fragrance, I'll use that overused phrase, is to die for. The fragrance is so wonderful. It's as good as having a really nice dessert. It's that sweet and pleasant. Now, some of you, probably everyone who has grown a Daphne has had to decide that, all right, next week at 2:00 on Thursday, I'm going to die and they'll be dead on that day. I worked with somebody who called them suicide plants. And so some people get to the point where they think, oh, it's not worth growing. I'm sorry, if you get 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years out of it and you have that incredible fragrance for almost a month in the winter, it's worth replanting. It'd be worth planting if you had to plant it once a year. The fragrance is that good. So if you don't know it, you need to know it and add it to your shade garden. They're usually pretty expensive. It's a slow growing plant. You know, this is, I need to stand by it. My knees are about 2 feet, so it's maybe almost 30 inches tall. And this is, you know, pretty good sized plant. And it was a 2010 accession, so maybe it came in a 1-gallon pot or something, or maybe smaller. So little plants are expensive, but they're worthwhile. We met the big Solomon seal, and I promised you others. This is a small species, Disperopsis Undulata. There's a bunch of different Disperopsis species, and a lot of them are more similar than different. They are evergreen, so they're nice small scale ground covers for the shade because they spread slowly. If you want to increase the spread, dig them up and divide them and spread them out further. They're easy as can be, and just handsome little evergreen herbaceous perennial. And like most evergreen herbaceous perennials, like the evergreen epimediums and stuff, or evergreen ferns, you really want to cut it down in late winter because though they are green through the winter, each leaf only lasts for, you know, a whole year. And so by the time they're putting up new growth, whether it's on an evergreen fern or the evergreen epimediums, the old foliage is going by and you're looking at all the fresh new growth with the old foliage dying around it. So it's easier to remove the old growth before it puts up new. Now, I'm saying all that and thinking, well, things like the tongue fern is more evergreen than that. So I wouldn't cut that whole thing to the ground, and I wouldn't cut Aspidistra all the way to the ground, but just cut out the ones that go by.
I have a question for you, Doug.
Yes, sir.
Will is asking in our chat, does that Daphne get irrigated twice a day as well?
Yes.
You're probably wondering how, as in how it's still living.
Well, that's a valid question. I described the growing conditions in the Lath House as Garden of Eden, and that would be evenly moist but well-drained soil. So it does get irrigated twice a day, but the soil is really well drained. Tim's now standing in the background, so he can correct me if I get the details wrong. But the mix in the soil is probably equal parts permatill, leaf mold, and pine bark fines, or maybe some earth. Do you remember? Or was that before your time, Tim?
No, it's compost and fine.
I don't think there's any more.
Is there no sand or anything?
There might be some sand, but not a lot. It was a roof garden blend.
Okay. Well, Tim, I don't know if you heard that. Tim is saying it's a roof garden blend that is very light and very well drained. So there's a world of difference between watering something twice a day when it's super well drained. It's almost, well, no, it's as opposed to, I worked in a garden where I couldn't convince my boss that we didn't need to run the irrigation once a day on red clay. And so I learned an awful lot about plants that tolerate wet sites, and which didn't. Okay. How are we doing for time?
You are over, Doug.
Oh, okay.
No one's itching to go anywhere, but if you'd like, we can do some questions, unless you have another plant or two to show everyone.
Well, there are another 50 plants in the lath house we could talk about, but that could be our next shade garden presentation.
Let's get that for the next one. So how about some questions? We'll go ahead and take some questions in the chat. And I know we had a good one earlier. I think it was Mary Ann that asked. So is the lath house sun, part shade, or shade?
Yes.
So there's your answer, Mary Ann. Yes, it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, maybe the better term would be filtered sun. When the sun is out, there is definitely sun on the plants. And you can probably see that now because the sun is out. If the sun is out, there is sun shining on plants, but with the movement of the sun, no part of the leaf blade is in sun for terribly long. So I always think I try to remember to think of the lath house as being really more of a sunny area than a shady area. There are some things, I pointed out the begonia that has horrible looking foliage, which might be because of too much sun. And there was a chloranthus that we had some divisions of that we planted in a dark and gloomy spot in the Asian Valley, and that foliage remained really nice, clean green, but the parent plant in here, the foliage turns black, I think, from too much sun. So the lath house is really more sun than shade.
We just have another question. This one was from Annette. She is wondering what kind of begonias are hardy.
I'm going to sound like I'm giving a sarcastic answer. The ones that are hardy are the ones that are hardy.
There you go.
Most of the ones I've showed you today with beautiful, colorful foliage don't look that much different than the 10,000 other begonias that are not winter hardy. So, you can buy every begonia from a houseplant greenhouse and plant them in the ground, and I would guess that none of them proved to be winter hardy, but maybe some of them will. The very first one, the one that's probably Begonia Palmata, was collected in northern India, probably high elevation in northern India.
I don't think there's otherwise a particular group or an organization of any kind that's hardy and whatnot. So in that, I think a good suggestion would, of course, just be some internet sleuthing, or even just hop on our own website and see what begonias we have planted, because those should have some hardiness, or at least ones that we're trialing, because we specialize in plants that are hardy outdoors. We're not going around planting the bedding begonias everywhere other than color trials or maybe a few leftover ones in random spots, but they're not in our online database to begin with.
And, the Arboretum isn't, we're about trialing plants, trialing things that might have a chance of being winter hardy, but we're not sure. So we plant them out and see. And, most of the new hardy begonias that we've grown have only been tested for a few winters, and they haven't been extremely cold winters. So if we had a typical Zone 8 winter, they might all disappear. But thus far, they've come through winter, and some of them come here from other sources where those people are saying they've been winter hardy for them. A colleague in, I think it was Tennessee, sent us starts of some things that have been hardy for them in Tennessee.
So Will has a question over here about the Tricertus, going back to the variegated one. He's wondering, does the variegated Tricertus sacrifice anything in performance or flowering versus the regular, as in the green one?
I don't really know the answer to that question. Some species of Tricertus are just showier in bloom than others. And when Tricertus hirta was one of the first ones that was widely grown, 20, 30 years ago, and it's quite showy in bloom, and the variegated forms seem to bloom just as well.
I think maybe what his question is asking is, does the variegation knock it down so much energy-wise that it can't flower? Because some variegated plants just are weaker and don't perform as well.
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. One of the most vigorous Tricertus we grow is Tricertus formosanum autumn glow. And, we're trying to get it out of the lath house, and it keeps on coming back from every piece of rhizome left in the ground. So that one, if it's less vigorous than the green one, we better start running from the green one because it's probably going to bulldoze us over. So it might be the case. There's different degrees of variegation.
I couldn't find it in the database.
The which plant?
Mahonia.
Well, it's Mount Emei, Sean. EMEI. Here comes the label. Mount Emei. Is Mount Emei the same as Omi? OMEI is another spelling for this mountain's name. It's apparently an amazing place to collect plants in China. Shan, S-H-A-N, is Chinese for mountain. So when you see something Shan, then you know it's a mountain.
Diane is wondering, where is the begonia teardrop located? Was that the one that's near the circle part in the path in the Asian Valley?
Yeah, if she's familiar with Asian Valley, if you come up the path from the bottom of Asian Valley, there's a circular wall and a circular paved area, and it's right above the wall. It's just been flawless.
Yeah.
Tim, I noticed in the Plant Delights catalog, it says starts blooming in June. It almost seems like it started earlier than that.
I'd still say June.
Okay, Tim's thinking June. But
Paul is asking, a few weeks ago, we showed Syningia growing in what looked like full sun.
yes,
He's wondering, is it flexible enough to grow in the part sun like in the lath house?
the lath house I would tend to think would be sunny enough for them to survive. I suspect they'd get lanky. You could probably grow the common lantana in here, but it wouldn't be nice and compact. It'd be sprawly. It's just the case that in any one group of plants, there's some that want shade, insist on shade, and others that are much better out in full sun. A real pretty little shade-loving Syningia we grow that's out in the pedestrian entrance beds is Syningia Eumorpha. It looks like a little white foxglove flower on a rosette foliage, like the old florist gloxinia that you don't see for sale anymore.
That looks like it's it for the questions here in the chat. So unless someone has any more questions real fast, does someone have a question verbally?
What is the name of the plant that you're holding in your hand that was next to Daphne odora?
I didn't hear the whole question.
What is the plant that you're holding in your hand? And none of us are holding a plant in our hand.
I just threw whatever I was holding away. Oh, the Disperopsis. That's right. The Disperopsis is one of the genera, one of the genera closely related to Polygonatum, all known as Solomon seal or evergreen Solomon seal.
And here's a good one from Linda. Doug, she says that her Akuba got leggy this year rather than bushy. How can she make it shorter and bushier? Any particular pruning methods that you'd recommend, or even a time?
If it's a young plant, then what she just needs is patience. Plants are like people. They tend to be tall and scrawny when they first get that growth spurt as a young teenager. and just fill out in time. You know, a shrub with multiple stems will produce additional stems and fill out. If it's scrawny for some other reason, you can cut a cuba back as hard as you want, and it will tend to branch out lower and be fuller. There are, there are cubas like petite jade that's only about 18 inches tall, maybe 2 feet tall. So if you need one that stays small, then choose one of the cultivars that stays small.
And,
This is Suzanne. Hello.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi. You may have covered this, Doug, but I'm not sure. The lath house laths are running north to south, so that as the sun goes east-west, it's constantly moving shade. You always want to run your... And then the other thing is that I believe that it's 70% sun. If you look at the spacing of the laths, you get 70% sun and 30% shade. Always.
Well, that would make sense because the space between the laths and our cameraman might look up at the roof of the lath house.
You can just put it right down there in the shadow.
Oh, yeah. You can see the spaces between the laths are bigger than the width of the laths themselves. So it's really more sun than shade, but with the shifting shade, nothing's baking in the sun. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was really helpful.
And we have another one here, part comment, part question. It's from Tina. She has said that she has a climbing hydrangea. It's her 3rd year. It looks healthy, but doesn't have any flowers. Is it not getting enough sun? And I will say mine didn't flower for most of the years that I had mine, and it was an ample sun. They
take years and years to get to a point where they will flower. So I think all you need is patience.
And I will add, and maybe it was just mine, maybe it was just the timing, but every time that it did flower, it really attracted Japanese beetles who would then eat it to smithereens, and they'd knock it back so much that it would take a few more years to flower again. So I never really wanted mine to flower.
And I remembered one thing to say about climbing hydrangeas. When they're first climbing, they're flat against whatever they're climbing, the wall or a tree trunk. It's only those little branches that are growing horizontally out from the main trunk that flower. And I worked for somebody who was a bit of a neatnik, and would cut those little horizontal shoots off. So it was just against the wall. And she wondered why our climbing hydrangea that had gotten quite large wasn't blooming. And you have to leave those little horizontal shoots that are growing out from whatever it's climbing on, because that's what it blooms on. The same for adult ivy. She also wondered why she wasn't getting any hellebore seedlings. And we pointed out the fact that she was cutting off the fruit before the seeds were dropped. So no people will be named.
And it looks like we have one more final question here, at least the only one I can see. Sharon's asking if she can root a cuba in water. Any comments about rooting in water overall, Doug?
Well, my general comment about rooting in water is it's not the best way to root because the roots are kind of funky. You can usually succeed with it, but it's not best. But a cuba is certainly easy to root in water. We sent some cuttings of a cuba to somebody, and he reported that his past experience of rooting cubas, he didn't have much success. And I thought, if you can't root a cuba, you're in trouble. Yeah, you can root it in water. It's super easy in the ground or in potting mix.
I know we had a volunteer who always said that she regularly rooted them in water, but they root readily in soil without any problem, except for that one person.
It's fun when a cuba root, because they have such a strong root system, they'll push themselves up out of the little cell packs we root them in.
They look like rooted mangroves.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Because they have really big, thick roots that kind of radiate out from the base. They're pretty awesome, and they're super, super easy to root. Well, it looks like that takes care of the questions, Doug.
Okay.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being out here, and thanks to everyone for coming in and joining a presentation with us. And we'll see you again next week for flowers for cutting. See you then. Have a great week.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.